when I knew that Jess Kahn was going to be in town, I asked her to stop by and to say a few words. I think without Jess's leadership at CMS, the work that certainly we've done at Stewards of Change, and many of you who've done across the country, we would not be in the same place at all. For those of you who know who Jess is and the work that she's done over the years, it's a guiding light for many of us, and particularly for the National Interoperability Collaborative. Her support, her partnership in bringing this about was phenomenal. So I wanted to make sure that we had a chance just to hear some words. I know she was here for most of the day today, and just to hear, as she's transitioned from government to private sector and now back into government, or at least consulting with government, just some words and some thoughts about how you're viewing the world and what you're hearing here today. So with that, please welcome Jess Kahn.
Did you hear that? He's trying to rush me back into government. I've been out like 7 months. I'm still in my recovery phase. Right, that's a whole other conversation over reception. Well, thank you, Daniel, for inviting me, and it's really nice to see this happening after a lot of discussion about it. So I'm Jess, and as Daniel said, I was at CMS for 10 years. My most recent role was as the head of technology and data for Medicaid at CMS, and I left about 7 months ago and joined McKinsey as a senior expert in, you guessed it, Medicaid and human services, technology and data. Which means I get to continue to work on the things that I love with people and colleagues that I enjoy tremendously, but from a different vantage point. So enough about me. So I've been to a lot of these forums over the years, getting bigger, I have to say, which is really nice, feeling like we're part of the norm now, and not just like the fringe geeks who were meeting in various places to talk about this. So it's pretty exciting to see the size and the scope and the real interest from a variety of different partners from the philanthropic side of the house, as well as continuing support from governments, state and local and federal. So I have a couple things I wanted to just sort of say as like the big, you can always rely on me to be the one who's like the very like practical, like this is the thing, like can we just do this thing? So I have 3 of like just those things. I'll try to keep it to 3. And then some thoughts about how to continue to make this work move forward. And clearly, I think underlying all of this is this idea of how do we find a pathway for sustainability for this work, because it can't just be through any one particular funding source. It has to be through a myriad of funding sources. So my 3 things that we just really, no matter how beautiful the use case and no matter how passionate, and I love the expansion into all of these different sectors. I think that's critical. We're getting closer to seeing people as human beings throughout throughout their lives. And we've heard really great illustrations, very powerful stuff today from everyone. But the things that I still see as problems and as obstacles to tackle, and they've come up today, the first one is semantic interoperability. For goodness sake, people, before anybody starts a new project and starts defining something, could you just look around and see if somebody else has already defined those same things? Find a standard, pick your favorite standard. I know that it's not a standard, but at least try to find something. And if you're a funder or a regulator of some sort, put that as a condition. Make it easy. Make it achievable, but also make it a condition. Thou shalt not come up with your own definitions of some of these basic things, okay? So that's one. Can I just say that this is awesome because no one else outside this room gets me when I talk about this kind of thing. If I went home and I told my kids somebody cheered for semantic interoperability, they'd be like, what is wrong with you? Okay, the second one is consent. So here's my thing about consent, and I don't have a magic wand to make it the way I want it, but consent is sticky, and I really think at this point, having watched this over a long time and from a variety of perspectives, that the only way to address it is face forward, head on. So figure out where those conversations about consents are having, and it's probably at a state level. and figure out where consent can be moved and where it can't. And that means there may not be one answer for everything. Maybe there's a box of things that can be opt-in and a box of things that are opt-out. But we've had this binary conversation of opt-in, opt-out now for at least a decade, and it's not going to get us anywhere. And then if you're trying to do something regional, you've just bounced up against each other's walls of who's opt-in and opt-out. Find the things and have the conversations with the people who have the power to change those things and make decisions. But you have to deal with this with consent. It just doesn't go away, and the more that we actually make headway in talking about people as real people throughout these buckets, the worse the consent topic becomes, because then that's just another group of people who have their own opinion about where consent should be. And the third one is identity management. So there's actually some interesting things going on in this one that make me a little more encouraged than I might have been before. So you guys have heard about this conversation of a citizen view. Anyone talk to like major CIOs who talk about a citizen view? First of all, I don't mean citizen like in the legal sense of the word. I mean citizen because they can't all agree on some word that just basically means a person. So I'll tell you what this is, and if any of you track any of the national state CIO conversations, this is a big topic for them. It's this idea that, be it a portal or an identifier or a master data management approach that looks at, say, Peter, since he was the only one brave enough to raise his hand, as Peter the citizen. So that means his data is his identity is verified, not just for his clinical or whatever else programs he's needing, but also when it's time to get his driver's license renewed, and when it's time to get his tags on his car that have expired renewed, or for him to figure out where's his voting location. So there are a number of different states who have started to think about this. The UK went this like full Monty, which I can say because that is a British term for anyone who's tracking. They went full Monty on this, and there is a single website that is everything sort of UK government citizen view. So whether it's health or human services or completely unrelated, there are some smaller versions of this. Like if anyone's aware, I mean, San Diego's got some of these things. Idaho also has put some things together that include like veteran services and education and stuff. But when I mean citizen view, I mean truly all of those different parts of you, even the parts of you that get parking tickets and those kinds of things, so that you can attach this cart to the horse that is trying to define who we are as we operate through a myriad of different government services, government little g, and therefore my identity, if I took Carrie's Rubik's Cube looking box on data access, right, with all those different user roles, you could have those same number of roles, just you as a human being and interacting with government. In fact, you do. You just have probably 50 passwords to interact with all those different services. So I say all that to say it'd be interesting to get engaged in those citizen view discussions in your state or locality and see where those things are going. The idea is, first of all, you're not the only one who wants to know that, you know, what were we talking about earlier? John Smith is also, Jack Smith is also whatever. But it's also that it destigmatizes the reasons why you want that done. I loathe the word welfare. Just don't even say it in my vicinity. I wish I could strike it from every public website and the implications therein. It no longer means what Webster's thinks it's supposed to mean. So I don't want my information out there in terms of my or my family's welfare. I want it out there just because that's across all of the myriad of services I need. I don't want to have multiple different ways of having to engage when I can have a streamlined single place. This is where I go. I live in Maryland. You know, what if I went to the same place in Maryland for a variety of different services, from whether it was for me or for my family? So you get the point. Pay attention to citizen view, because this is an interesting perception on identity management. Okay, so those are the big three. A couple things to think about also that I'm seeing, just little tips. I see, we did this, the federal government, I still see states and many others do that, and that's collect nice to have data. How many of you have been in a room where someone's talking like, wouldn't it be amazing if we could? Okay, I kind of even saw some of that on slides today. Like, the goal would be that we could, fill in the blank, right? These amazing goals, huge goals. Like, that's a lot. Just come up with 3 priority use cases, 3 things, no need to haves, only have your must-haves, and define what it's going to be, what data is needed, and please accept that the data is only going to be 80% good. This is not a clinical trial. Academic rigor is not necessary. These are operational data sets. The 80-20 rule applies. Write it down. 80-20 rule applies. So that data is, you might have to triangulate it with a couple other sources in order to vet it. You might have to, ask me if that's true, the thing that's said about me in that system. There's a beautiful way to validate your data. Or you might just have to say, this is enough to be able to trigger an additional investigation or another look into what's going on here. Like, I liked Uma's example of what's happening. She had a data point and said, what's happening? Why aren't people showing up? She didn't bring the house down because people weren't showing up. She actually used that as a data point to look into it. I had an example in a state where something happened the same, where they were finding that these particular doctors, their flu vaccination rates were really low in this community health clinic compared to all of the other flu docs, and compared to all of the other docs. And this is what this data was meant to show. It was meant to sort of track performance and quality across all of the providers. And instead of calling them out or doing something immediately negative based upon that data, they went and checked the schedule and talked to those doctors. Well, those doctors were doing some kind of quick screening for something. It was like a quick sick or a quick something. Like, that wasn't even in the protocol. It wasn't even available for them to do. It's like sometimes you have to actually just use the data at the 80% good enough level and then ask a few questions. So I would just find your first 3 use cases and I would make them proactive, not reactive. So this is what really fascinates me, is this idea that there's a trigger event, something happens, and then the data automatically starts to come in. Not you have to go figure it out. So a kid gets sick. No, that's not a good example. Let's use it. So I lose my job. And now I have to go apply for all these benefits. That's the reality, right? What would happen if I lost my job and my resume was immediately shot out to a bunch of different recruiters and temp agencies because it was some place where I could have that uploaded and retained? What if I got outreach and information in the mail asking me if I needed childcare or transportation or job training or health insurance? Like, where's the proactive trigger of events? Like, those things happen every day when we're on the internet. So I bought something this weekend. I don't even remember what it was, but I got one of those little cards that says, the Wine of the Month Club. You get like $100 off of like this big case of wines, and it's all the non-branded ones. So I take a look at it. I get like halfway through it, and I decide, I can't drink that much wine. I'm the only one in my family who drinks wine. Where am I even going to put a case of wine in my house? I really need more sleep. So I nixed it all out. Don't you know, I have like 5 emails in my inbox the next morning. I never even finished it. 5 emails in my inbox the next morning, not just about wine, but around all kinds of things related to wine. Why doesn't that happen when I lose my job? Well, it's not for lack of technology, right? So anyway, this idea of being proactive, finding 3 proactive use cases would be great. And so then the last thing I want to talk about is incentives. I mean, good gracious, if all that was needed is that we all shared what each other did, we'd have been done with this. We'd have conquered the world. I have heard Uma talk, I don't know how many times, Carrie from San Diego, I don't know how many times. There's brilliance happening all over the country in all of these places. Bill, this has been part of what people in this community are so great at, is sharing what they do with each other, not necessarily in a way that there's some place where you can go and pull something down, which is what Danielle's trying to accomplish through all this effort, is to try and create more of a collaborative, but still sharing is not the problem. This group has no trouble with turf this way, right? So that's not the problem. The problem is are there the business incentives, carrots or sticks, that make this kind of interoperability across programs make it table stakes? So again, funding should be tied to looking at this broad use of this information, if that funding is available, and there should be positive incentives. So before I get to the positive, just going back to the funding, thinking about it from a federal perspective, if I had a redo, one of the things that I would do differently already, it's pretty sad, but I'll find the people to tell. One of the things I would do differently is I would be much more rigorous about asking for an alternatives analysis and a landscape assessment. Before you take any federal dollars, $90, $10, to go do whatever it is around data sharing between XYZ programs and whatever kind of infrastructure you're going to do for integrated eligibility and however you're going to do it, have you built a fact base that says this is what's already happening in other places, this is why this is the best way for us, or maybe a mix of what they're doing and what they're doing, but do you have a fact base that looks at risk, cost, sustainability, disruption to the program, minimal looking for, all of those different variables. Where's your fact base to show that? Because what I think often happens is people just go with what they know and they don't actually kick the tires and look under the hood. So I would ask for more of that. On the positive side, since I don't want to depress you thoroughly before your reception, is I think that setting aside personalities that Lisa was talking about and having to play poker with people and all those things, it is true. It often comes down to the cult of personality of certain people who are just amazing at connecting everyone. So setting aside that, is there a way to incentivize this? I know Daniel mentioned a fellows program. If you can't create something that's that formal, you can still knight people within your organization. You could say within your team, you are the one whose job it is to always be on the lookout to see, are we being too narrow? Are we staying too close to our swim lane? Are there other people who have done this? Who's not at this table? And pick the person who's not the best at sharing. Like, don't pick the person for whom that's an easy ask. Pick the person for whom that's a challenging ask, because then everyone else will see that that person is doing it and they'll give it more gravitas. Like, I always pick somebody to be a devil's advocate in team meetings so that I don't just get a lot of yeses. So you pick somebody whose job it is to champion this if you can't actually give somebody a real title to do it. But I think it would be helpful to give people a title. There has to be real skin in the game. Oh, I hate that phrase. Okay, there has to be real incentive for this to continue, because just sharing our stories is not making it happen enough and not fast enough. So I'm excited. That doesn't mean we don't still need to come together and do all of these things. It's really critical that we do that, because that's part of the way we learn and we foster our education, our information. And I know that a lot of us here are great dot connectors and tell people who to talk to in other states and other localities, and that's still a big part of it. Because if you are going to appoint somebody to look out over the horizon, you still need to know how to point them which direction and where and how. I just think there needs to be a lot more formality to it. I just feel like right now it's pretty loosey-goosey on a state or local basis. And I don't think it's time for that anymore. That's my 7 months worth of non-fed wisdom. Just imagine where I'll be a year from now, right? My 19 months, yeah. All right, well, thank you, and I look forward to talking to you guys more.